Hello guys, today we are going to discuss this topic like this. A war between brothers that changed a nation, a true story of betrayal, ambition, and a kingdom that nearly tore itself apart. This is not just the tale of two royal heirs fighting for a crown. This is the story of how England fell into darkness, how families turned against one another, and how one civil war reshaped the future of an entire country forever. Imagine waking up one morning in medieval England. The church bells ring, the markets open, and life seems normal. But behind the stone walls of castles and the polite smiles of nobles, a storm is brewing. A king has died, and with him the fragile balance that held the realm together. Two people now claim the throne. They share the same royal blood. They were raised under the same roof. Yet soon they will become bitter enemies. This is the story of Empress Matilda and Stephen of Blois, cousin and cousin, royalty and royalty. Two heirs of King Henry I, and when Henry died in 1135, he left behind a kingdom with no clear ruler and a future soaked in blood. To understand how everything fell apart, we must go back to a tragedy that happened years before any sword was drawn. In the year 1120, a terrible disaster struck the English royal family. King Henry I's only legitimate son, William Adelin, was sailing back from France on a ship called the White Ship. The vessel was overloaded, its crew drunk, and the sea rough. Not long after leaving the harbor, the ship struck a rock and sank. Almost everyone on board drowned. William Adelin, the heir to the English throne, was dead. When the news reached King Henry, it is said that he collapsed in grief. With his son gone, the future of the dynasty was suddenly uncertain. Henry still had children, but only one legitimate one remained, his daughter Matilda. Matilda was not an ordinary princess. She had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor and crowned Empress of much of Europe. She was intelligent, educated, and politically experienced. After her husband's death, Henry brought her back to England and made a bold decision. He declared Matilda his heir. This was almost unheard of in medieval Europe. A woman ruling England in her own right was a dangerous idea to many nobles. Still, Henry forced the great lords of the realm to swear an oath to support Matilda when he died. Among those who swore loyalty was Henry's favorite nephew, Stephen of Blois. Stephen was charming, brave, and popular with the nobility. He was also ambitious. For years, England remained calm, but the peace rested on a fragile promise. Everyone knew that when Henry died, the real test would begin. That moment came in December 1135. King Henry I died suddenly in Normandy. News traveled slowly in those days, but Stephen moved fast. He crossed the English Channel in a rush, went straight to London, and declared himself king. With the support of powerful nobles and the church, Stephen was crowned within weeks. Matilda was in France at the time. By the time she heard what had happened, her throne had already been taken. The oath meant nothing now. England had a new king, and he was not the woman Henry had chosen. Matilda was furious. She was not a woman who accepted betrayal quietly. She began gathering supporters. Many lords still believed she was the rightful ruler. Others were angry that Stephen had broken his sworn oath. Slowly, the kingdom began to divide. Two sides formed, those who supported King Stephen and those who supported Empress Matilda. At first, it did not seem like it would become a full-scale war, but beneath the surface, resentment was growing. Nobles built up their armies. Castles were reinforced. Every lord waited for the moment when fighting would begin. And when it did, it was not like any war England had ever known. This conflict would not be fought on distant battlefields against foreign invaders. It would be fought in villages, towns, and farmlands. It would be neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. The chroniclers of the time would later call it simply the Anarchy. As the first clashes began, something terrifying happened. The authority of the king, whether Stephen or Matilda, started to crumble. Powerful nobles realized they could do whatever they wanted. They built castles without permission, raised private armies, and ruled their lands like kings. England fractured into hundreds of little war zones. Farmers were robbed by soldiers. Towns were burned. Trade collapsed. Famine spread. One writer of the time described the horror with chilling words. Men said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep. It meant the world had fallen into chaos. Stephen struggled to control the realm. He was brave in battle but weak in politics. He trusted the wrong people and forgave traitors too easily. Each time he tried to restore order, another noble rebelled. Matilda, meanwhile, prepared to strike. In 1139, she finally invaded England. With a small but loyal army, she landed on the coast and marched inland. The Civil War had truly begun. For years, the fighting went back and forth. Castles were besieged, armies clashed, towns changed hands again and again. Then in 1141, everything came to a head at a place called Lincoln. This battle would decide the fate of the crown. Stephen marched north with his army to confront Matilda's forces. He was outnumbered, but he refused to retreat. The king rode into battle at the front, fighting like a knight of legend. His sword broke, his axe shattered. Still, he kept swinging, using whatever weapon he could grab. But in the end, Stephen was overwhelmed. He was knocked down, captured, and taken prisoner. For the first time since Henry's death, Matilda held her rival in chains. She was now, in theory, Queen of England, but winning a battle is not the same as winning a kingdom. Matilda entered London to claim her crown, yet instead of welcoming her, the city turned against her. She demanded heavy taxes and punished those who had supported Stephen. The people rebelled, riots broke out, Matilda was forced to flee. Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, gathered an army. She fought to free her husband. Soon, Stephen was released in a prisoner exchange. The war continued. By now, England was exhausted. No one trusted anyone. Fields lay empty. Villages were ruins. Nobles were rich, but the common people were starving. Years dragged on. Neither side could win. Matilda would never wear the crown. Stephen would never secure peace. But from this chaos, a new future was rising. Matilda had a son. His name was Henry Plantagenet, and one day he would change everything. Henry Plantagenet was still a boy when England was tearing itself apart. But even as a child, he could feel the weight of the war that had stolen his mother's throne. While castles burned and armies marched across the countryside, Henry was being shaped by exile, ambition, and the bitter lessons of betrayal. He was Matilda's greatest hope, her living claim to the crown, and the future she believed would restore what Stephen had taken. Henry was not raised like a sheltered prince. His childhood was spent moving between courts in France, surrounded by knights, warriors, and scheming nobles. From an early age, he was taught that power was never given, it was taken. He listened to his mother's stories of England, of how she had been cheated of her birthright, and how a kingdom had been dragged into chaos by Stephen's betrayal. Those stories burned inside him like a slow fire. By the time Henry reached his teenage years, he was already showing signs of the man he would become: tall, sharp-eyed, energetic, and fiercely determined. While Stephen struggled to hold onto a crumbling throne, Henry was growing into a warrior who believed that England was his destiny. In 1147, when Henry was just 14 years old, he made a bold move that shocked everyone. Without a large army, without real money, and without the full support of powerful lords, he sailed to England to challenge King Stephen. It was a reckless act. Many thought it was suicidal, but to Henry it was necessary. He landed on the English coast with a handful of knights and immediately began calling for support. His name alone, being Matilda's son and Henry I's grandson, was enough to inspire some lords to join him. But the reality of war was harsh. Stephen still held most of the kingdom, and Henry was too young and too weak to fight him directly. After a few small skirmishes, Henry was forced to retreat back to France. It was a failure, but it was also a lesson. Henry returned to the continent wiser, angrier, and more determined than ever. Over the next few years, he built something far more powerful than an army. He built alliances. Through marriage, diplomacy, and force, he began assembling a vast network of territories across France. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, one by one, they fell under his control. By the early 1150s, Henry was no longer a boy. He was one of the most powerful men in Europe. Meanwhile, in England, Stephen's situation was getting worse. Years of civil war had weakened his rule. The nobles no longer feared him. Many had grown rich from chaos, and peace would threaten their power. Stephen tried again and again to restore order, but every attempt failed. The kingdom was tired of him, tired of the war, and tired of a king who could not bring stability. Then tragedy struck Stephen in a way that mirrored Matilda's own past. His son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly in 1153. The future of Stephen's dynasty vanished overnight. With Eustace gone, Stephen had no clear successor. The throne was once again uncertain, and everyone knew what that meant. England was on the brink of yet another round of bloodshed, but this time there was a difference. Henry Plantagenet was ready. In 1153, Henry crossed the Channel again. This time he did not come as a desperate teenager. He came as a conqueror. His army was large, disciplined, and loyal. Lords who had once supported Stephen began to defect. They were tired of endless war. They saw Henry as a chance for something new, a strong ruler who could finally bring peace. The two sides faced each other across England. Once again, the country prepared for another brutal conflict. But something unexpected happened. Neither Stephen nor Henry truly wanted to fight. Stephen was old, worn down by years of war. He had lost his son. He had lost the loyalty of many of his nobles. He knew that even if he won one more battle, he might still lose everything in the end. Henry, on the other hand, was confident. He knew time was on his side. He had the stronger position. Why risk everything in a single bloody clash when victory could be won another way? So instead of swords, they chose negotiation. In the town of Wallingford, the two sides met. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the war between Matilda's line and Stephen's line was brought to the table instead of the battlefield. The result was the Treaty of Wallingford. Under its terms, Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry Plantagenet would be named his official heir. When Stephen died, the crown would pass to Henry. The Civil War was over. 18 years of chaos, suffering, and bloodshed ended not with a final battle, but with an agreement. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry became King Henry II of England, and with him began a new era. Henry II did not forget what the Anarchy had done to England. He had seen the ruins. He had heard the stories of starving villages and lawless warlords. He knew exactly how close the kingdom had come to collapse, so he set out to rebuild it. The first thing Henry did was crush the power of the rebellious nobles. He ordered the destruction of hundreds of illegal castles, those private fortresses that lords had used to terrorize the countryside during the war. One by one, they were torn down. The message was clear. The age of warlord kings was over. Next, Henry reformed the justice system. He created traveling royal judges who enforced the king's law across the land. No longer would each lord rule his territory like a personal kingdom. England would have one law, one authority. He strengthened the monarchy. He expanded royal power. He built a government that could actually control the country. The England that emerged after the Anarchy was not the same England that had existed before it. It was stronger, more centralized, and more stable. And all of it was born from a war between two members of the same family. Stephen and Matilda never truly defeated each other, but through their struggle, a new dynasty was forged. The Plantagenets would rule England for over 300 years, overseeing some of the most important moments in the nation's history. Magna Carta, the 100 Years' War, the rise of Parliament, all of it traced back to this one terrible civil war, a war that began because one man broke an oath, a war that showed how fragile a kingdom can be, a war between brothers and cousins that changed a nation forever. The war between Stephen and Matilda did not end cleanly when Henry II took the throne. The battles may have stopped, but the scars of the Anarchy were carved deep into England's soul. Entire regions had been ruined, families had been wiped out, trust between the king and the nobility was shattered. Henry II inherited not just a crown, but a broken country that still trembled from the chaos of civil war. As Henry rode through his new kingdom, he saw the damage with his own eyes. Villages that had once thrived were now nothing but burned timbers and abandoned fields. Old Roman roads were cracked and overgrown. Churches stood half empty, their priests struggling to feed their flocks. The people of England had learned to fear soldiers, nobles, and even their own neighbors. They had survived nearly 2 decades of lawlessness. Henry understood something that neither Stephen nor Matilda ever truly grasped. A king could not rule by force alone. England was to survive. It needed not just a strong ruler, but a system that could prevent another civil war from ever happening again. So Henry began the greatest rebuilding project England had ever seen. He reorganized the royal government. He created new offices to manage finances, courts, and military power. The exchequer was strengthened so taxes could be collected fairly and efficiently. The royal treasury, which had been looted and mismanaged during the war, began to fill again. But Henry knew money was not enough. The real problem that had caused the Anarchy was this: the nobles had become too powerful. During Stephen's weak rule, the barons had learned that they could ignore the king, raise their own armies, and rule their lands like independent states. Henry could not allow that to continue, so he acted. One by one, he summoned the most powerful lords to his court. Some came willingly, others came in fear, and some refused to come at all. Those who refused were declared rebels. Henry moved quickly and ruthlessly. Castles were seized, lands were confiscated, armies loyal to the crown marched into rebellious territories and crushed resistance. In a matter of years, the barons who had once acted like kings were forced back into line. For the first time in a generation, England had a ruler who was truly in control. But the legacy of the war was not only political, it was deeply personal. Henry had grown up watching his mother, Matilda, fight for a crown she never wore. She had been betrayed by those who swore loyalty to her. She had been driven from London by mobs. She had seen the kingdom fall apart around her. Those experiences shaped Henry. He was suspicious. He was quick to anger. He trusted no one completely, not even his own family. And tragically, history would repeat itself. Henry II would go on to have many sons. He wanted to create a strong dynasty, one that would never face the kind of succession crisis that had destroyed his grandfather's reign. So he gave his sons lands, titles, and power while he was still alive. He believed this would secure peace. Instead, it would lead to another war between fathers and sons, brothers against brothers, just like before. The shadow of the anarchy never truly left England. It was a warning burned into history. When the line of succession is weak, a kingdom can tear itself apart. Looking back at Stephen and Matilda, it is easy to see them as enemies, but in truth, they were both victims of a broken system. Medieval England had no clear rules for who should rule when a king died without a son. Oaths could be broken, claims could be ignored, whoever had the most support and the fastest army could take the throne. Stephen had taken advantage of that chaos. Matilda had suffered from it, and England had paid the price. The anarchy was not just a war, it was a collapse of order itself. People born during those years grew up knowing nothing but violence. Children watched their villages burn. Farmers learned to hide their food. Women and men alike lived in fear of soldiers who might arrive at any moment and take everything. This was the hidden cost of the war between Stephen and Matilda. When Henry II finally brought stability, it felt like a miracle. Churches were rebuilt, markets reopened, roads became safer, life slowly returned to normal. But the memory of the chaos never faded. For centuries, English kings would look back at the anarchy as a nightmare to be avoided at all costs. It influenced how they handled succession, how they dealt with the nobility, and how they structured the monarchy. In a strange way, the suffering of that war made England stronger. It taught rulers that a weak crown meant disaster. It taught nobles that rebellion could destroy the land they lived on. And it taught the people that peace was fragile and precious. Stephen died in 1154, a tired and broken man. He had wanted to be a good king, but history remembers him as the ruler who lost control of his kingdom. Matilda lived to see her son crowned. Though she never became queen, she knew that her bloodline now ruled England. In the end, she had won, just not in the way she had imagined. And Henry II went on to become one of the most powerful kings England had ever known. But it all began with one moment in 1135. One king died, one oath was broken. And a nation fell into darkness. Even after Henry II secured the throne and restored order, the memory of the anarchy lingered like a ghost over England. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as though even mentioning those dark years might invite the chaos back. It had become a warning passed from generation to generation, a story of what happens when loyalty collapses and ambition overpowers duty. But to truly understand how deeply that war changed the nation, we must look beyond kings and queens. We must look at the people who lived through it. For the peasants, the anarchy was not about who sat on the throne, it was about survival. Fields that had fed families for generations were trampled by armies. Crops were burned before they could be harvested. Livestock was stolen. Hunger became a constant companion. Many villages disappeared entirely, wiped from the map by war or abandoned when their inhabitants fled. Travelers wrote of roads lined with empty houses and churches with no congregations. England, once a growing and prosperous land, had been dragged backward by its own rulers. The church, too, was deeply shaken. Monasteries were looted, priests were threatened. Some bishops openly took sides, turning holy places into military strongholds. The spiritual heart of the kingdom was torn apart just like everything else. It was not just a civil war, it was a moral collapse, and yet from that collapse something new began to grow. Henry II understood that if England was ever to avoid another anarchy, it needed more than a strong king. It needed rules that were stronger than any one man. So he created something revolutionary, the idea that even nobles were subject to the law. Before Henry, a powerful lord could commit crimes, wage private wars, and escape punishment. During the anarchy, this had turned England into a battlefield of personal vendettas. Henry put an end to that. He created royal courts. He introduced trial by jury. He sent judges across the kingdom to enforce the king's justice. For the first time, ordinary people could appeal to a higher authority than their local lord. This was one of the most important changes in English history. It laid the foundation for the legal system that would one day shape not just England, but much of the modern world. In this way, the war between Stephen and Matilda indirectly created a fairer society. It had shown what happened when power was uncontrolled, and Henry made sure that never happened again. But the human cost was never forgotten. Chroniclers wrote about families torn apart, about children growing up without parents, about towns that never recovered. They wrote about the fear, the uncertainty, and the endless waiting for peace that never seemed to come. To them, the anarchy was not just a chapter in history. It was a nightmare they had lived through. Even centuries later, historians would struggle to fully understand how close England had come to total collapse. Had the war continued for a few more years, it is possible the kingdom might have shattered into separate states, each ruled by a warlord. The idea of England as one united nation could have been lost. That is why this war matters. It was not just about Stephen and Matilda. It was about whether England would survive as a country at all, and somehow against all odds it did. When Henry II took power, he brought not just peace but ambition. He expanded English influence across France. He built an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. England became a major force in Europe once more. None of that would have been possible without the end of the anarchy. The war between brothers had forged a stronger kingdom. Yet even as Henry built his empire, the shadow of the past followed him. He knew how easily loyalty could turn to rebellion. He knew how quickly family could become enemies. And so he ruled with both brilliance and fear. He was determined that no one, not even his own sons, would ever plunge England back into civil war. But history, as always, had its own plans. The shadow of the anarchy never truly left England. Even as Henry II ruled with power and intelligence, the memory of Stephen and Matilda's war lived on in every law he passed and every decision he made. He knew what unchecked ambition could do. He had seen a kingdom collapse because one family could not agree on who should wear a crown. Henry wanted something different for his sons, but history has a cruel way of repeating itself. Henry II had 4 sons who survived into adulthood: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. He loved them, but he also distrusted them. He tried to divide power among them while keeping control for himself, believing this would keep the peace. Instead, it planted the seeds of another disaster. Just like Stephen and Matilda, Henry's sons would one day rise against him. Brothers would fight brothers. Sons would turn against their father. And England would once again tremble on the edge of chaos. The anarchy had taught one great lesson: when bloodlines collide with ambition, even the strongest kingdoms can crack. But unlike Stephen's time, Henry had created institutions that could survive even when rulers failed. Courts, laws, and royal authority now stood between England and complete collapse. That was the true legacy of the war between brothers. The kingdom had been baptized in fire, and from that fire it had emerged stronger. When Stephen of Blois first crossed the Channel in 1135 and seized the throne, he could never have imagined what he was unleashing. He wanted power, he wanted a crown, but what he gave England instead was nearly 2 decades of suffering. Matilda, too, paid a terrible price. She lost the throne she had been promised. She was humiliated, driven from cities, and betrayed by allies. But in the end, her bloodline triumphed. Her son became king, and through him, her claim was finally honored. So who truly won the war? Not Stephen, not Matilda. England did, because from their conflict came a new understanding that the crown must be strong, that the law must be respected, and that a nation cannot survive if its leaders tear it apart from within. The Anarchy stands as one of the darkest chapters in English history, but it is also one of the most important. It showed how fragile civilization can be, and how powerful it can become when it is rebuilt. This was not just a medieval civil war, it was the moment England nearly lost itself and found itself again. So the next time you hear about kings, queens, and royal dynasties, remember Stephen and Matilda. Remember how a broken promise nearly destroyed a nation. And remember how from that chaos one of the greatest dynasties in English history was born, because history is not just about who wins, it is about what survives. If you enjoyed this epic story of betrayal, war, and destiny, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more powerful historical sagas like this. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought about this war between brothers, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from?